The first time they saw it, they laughed. Not quietly, not with restraint. Open laughter, the kind that spreads from one person to the next until it becomes something shared, something agreed upon. A judgment passed without trial, without evidence, without understanding. Cora Sutter was standing beside the half-finished frame when the Whitmore boys rode up along the fence line. Late afternoon lights stretched their shadows long across the frozen grass, and the horses moved slow breath, steaming in the October chill. They had been heading somewhere else, probably the Harkin place or maybe into town for supplies, but they slowed when they saw it. Slowed look did not understand, then decided they did. "What is it?" Jed asked the older one, 25 years of confidence built on nothing more than the fact that he had never failed at anything important. He had never tried anything important either, but that distinction would not occur to him for many years yet. "A tunnel," Cora said. He laughed before she finished the word. "A tunnel," he repeated, turning to his brother in the saddle beside him. Orrin was younger, maybe 20, with the kind of face that followed wherever Jed led. Between the house and the silo, Orrin leaned forward, studied the bent willow ribs rising from the earth. The woven sides half complete the shape forming in the air between two fixed points. He squinted as if seeing it from a different angle might help it make sense. "You're building a basket," he said slowly. "A basket big enough to live in." More laughter, louder this time. The horses shifted beneath them, made restless by the sharp sound cutting through the quiet afternoon. Cora did not respond. She had learned something in her 35 years on this earth, something that most people never figure out, even if they live twice as long. Explanation would not change their understanding. Understanding was not required, only completion. She picked up another length of willow, bent it into place, began weaving it through the existing frame. Her hands moved with the certainty of repetition, each motion practiced 100 times. Before this moment, each motion building towards something these boys could not yet see. They watched for a moment longer, waiting perhaps for her to explain, to defend, to argue. She did none of these things. Eventually, they rode off, still laughing. The sound carried longer than their horses did, drifting across the empty fields, reaching the house, the next farm the road. By evening, the story had spread through the valley like fire through dry brush. The widow building a woven tunnel between her house and her silo. The woman who thought branches could stop winter. The land here did not forgive mistakes. Cora had learned that in her first winter 12 years ago now, when she had arrived as a new bride with expectations formed somewhere kinder. She had come from the eastern part of the state where winters were cold, but manageable where towns existed close enough. Together that isolation was a choice rather than a condition. Here, in the northwestern corner of Minnesota, isolation was not a choice. It was the ground truth upon which everything else was built. The nearest neighbor was Holbrook, a mile and a half to the east. The nearest town was 7 miles south, and 7 miles in January might as well be 700, when the wind came hard across the open prairie. Her husband Thomas had understood this land in ways she was still learning when he died 3 winters past. A fever that started small and ended complete, taking him in 11 days, while she watched and prayed and bargained with a God who apparently was not in the bargaining business. After that, she was alone. Not entirely alone. She had the children to think of, had the farm to run, had the silo full of corn cobs for burning and the root cellar stocked for the cold months, and the chickens that needed feeding regardless of whether she felt capable of feeding anything, including herself. But alone in the ways that mattered, alone in the decisions that had to be made, alone in the consequences when those decisions proved wrong. The first winter after Thomas died, she almost lost everything. Not almost. She did lose things. Lost 2 fingers on her left hand to frostbite, the smallest ones taken by a 30-second exposure when she went to the silo without gloves, because she had not planned properly, had not thought, clearly had not understood yet what this land could do to a person who was not paying attention. The second winter was better. She had learned by then, had learned that preparation was not about supplies alone, but about systems, about understanding how cold moved, how wind moved, how heat escaped, and how to slow that escape. But even with better preparation, there were moments when the storm came so thick that the silo disappeared from sight 60 feet away, invisible as if it had never existed. Moments when she stood at her cabin door and could not see the structure that held everything she needed to survive, and the only guide was a rope strung between posts, a lifeline she could follow by touch when sight failed entirely. She had nearly died on that rope. Not nearly. She had been dying on that rope halfway between the cabin and the silo wind so hard it had knocked her to her knees. Snow so thick she could not tell up from down cold. So complete it had stopped feeling like cold and started feeling like nothing at all. The absence of sensation. The beginning of the end. She had survived. Barely. Had found the silo by luck as much as by the rope had filled her sack. Had made it back to the cabin by counting steps. Because counting was something the mind could do when the body was failing. But that night, sitting beside the stove with her children, pressed close, and the heat slowly returning to parts of her she had been certain were already dead, she understood something. The problem was not the cold. The problem was the crossing. Spring came late that year, as it always did, and when the snow finally melted and the ground softened enough to work, Cora walked the distance between her cabin and her silo. She walked it in the morning when the air was still. She walked it in the afternoon when the wind picked up from the west. She walked it in the evening when the light changed and shadows stretched long. She was not walking to measure distance. The distance was fixed. 63 feet from her door to the silo door, a measurement she knew as certainly as she knew her own children's faces. She was walking to understand. Where did the wind hit hardest? Where did it deflect? Where did it accelerate as it squeezed between structures? And where did it slow as it encountered obstacles? The land was flat here. Terribly flat, but not perfectly so. There were slight rises and depressions, changes in grade so subtle you could walk across them without noticing. But wind noticed. Wind responded to every variation, every interruption, every change in the surface it crossed. And so Cora noticed too. She spent weeks at this, walking, watching, feeling the air move against her face and hands, feeling where it pushed and where it pulled, and where it did neither. She marked spots on the ground with small stones, creating a map, that no one else could read a map of invisible forces that existed only in motion. The children watched her, sometimes confused but quiet. Ruth, the older one, 8 years old and already carrying more responsibility than any child should carry. James, younger at 6, following his sister's lead in everything. They did not ask what she was doing. They had learned as children of hard places learn that questions did not always have answers, and silence was often wiser than words. By midsummer, Cora knew what she was gonna build. Not a wall. Walls fought the wind, and fighting the wind was a battle you could not win. The wind was stronger than anything she could build. Stronger than wood. Stronger than stone. Stronger than any material she had access to in this forgotten corner of the prairie. Not a shelter either. Shelters were fixed points, and fixed points in a blizzard became obstacles, snow piling against them until they disappeared beneath white weight. Something else. Something that did not fight and did not hide. Something that yielded. The first willow branches came from the creek bed 2 miles north, where water had carved a shallow depression into the prairie, and trees grew in a thin line along its banks. Willow was not common here. Not thick enough to harvest in quantity, but there was enough for what she needed. She made the trip 4 times that first week, walking with an empty sled, and returning with bundles of green branches lashed together, pulled behind her like a penance. She had not been assigned but was performing anyway. The children helped when they could. Ruth learned to identify the right kind of willow, the young growth flexible enough to bend without breaking, thick enough to hold its shape when woven. James carried what he could carry, which was not much, but his presence mattered more than his contribution. They worked through July, then August. The frame rose slowly. Cora had never built anything like this before. She had seen basket weavers work years ago in her childhood, had watched their hands move through patterns that seemed impossible until you saw them repeated enough times that the impossibility became ordinary. She drew on those memories now, adapting them to a scale that those long-ago weavers could never have imagined. The tunnel started at the cabin's east wall, where she had cut a new door, a passage that led directly into the structure, rather than into open air. It rose from the ground in an arch willow ribs, bending upward and over like fingers interlacing, meeting at the top to form a continuous curve. 6 feet wide, tall enough to walk without stooping, 63 feet long. Between each rib she wove smaller branches horizontally, creating a mesh that grew tighter with each pass. The weave was not meant to block everything. That would have been impossible, and more than that, it would have been wrong. A solid wall creates pressure. Pressure creates failure. The weave was meant to interrupt, to slow, to break the wind into smaller pieces that could be survived even when the whole could not. She tested it constantly, every day, morning and evening, after wind, after rain, after the dry heat of August afternoons that cracked the mud she had applied to the outer surface. She walked the length of the tunnel with her eyes closed, sometimes feeling for movement in the air, feeling for weakness, because weakness was where failure would come. Not at the strongest points. Never at the strongest points. Systems failed at their weakest spots, and the only way to prevent that failure was to find those spots first and strengthen them before the test came. Word spread through the valley, as words always do in places where people have too much space and too little to fill it with. By the end of August, the tunnel no longer looked like branches. It looked intentional, shaped, defined. Still not solid, but no longer temporary. Something that belonged to the landscape rather than interrupting it, as if it had grown from the earth, rather than being constructed upon it. The children used it without being told to. They ran through it during the day, their voices changing inside the structure, becoming muted, contained. The sound was different in there. Softer, closer, the way sound changes when walls are near, even if those walls are made of woven branches rather than wood. Cora noticed this as she noticed everything. Sound follows air. Air movement reveals weakness. If the children's voices carried differently in certain sections, it meant the wind would too. It meant she needed to examine those sections to add more weave, more mud, more material to close the gaps. She could not see, but could hear. She listened. Always listened. And she worked. Always worked. Because the timeline was not hers to control. Winter came when winter came, regardless of whether she was ready. Regardless of whether the tunnel was complete, regardless of anything at all, except the turning of the earth and the tilting of its axis away from the sun. The calendar did not negotiate. They came again in late September, the Whitmore boys, this time with others. A small group had formed at the fence line, 4 or 5 men on horseback, looking at the structure that now stretched complete from cabin to silo. They did not ride onto her property. Some understanding, perhaps instinctive, perhaps informed by the stories they had heard about the widow who did not suffer. Fools kept them at a distance. They sat their horses and stared. Cora saw them from inside the tunnel, where she was applying another layer of mud to a section that had cracked during the week's dry spell. She did not stop working, did not acknowledge their presence. Eventually, one of them called out, "You think that will hold snow?" His voice carried well in the cool air. She recognized it as belonging to Stegner, a farmer from 3 miles south, a man known for his opinions and for the frequency with which he shared them. "It does not need to hold snow," she called back without looking up. "It needs to slow wind." She heard them talking among themselves, voices too low to distinguish words, but tones clear enough to understand. Skepticism, dismissal. The comfortable certainty of people who have not thought deeply about something, but are confident in their conclusions anyway. "Wind does not slow," Stegner called back. She continued working, because argument wastes time, and time was the only thing she did not have enough of. After a while, they rode away. She heard the hooves fading into the distance, heard the silence that followed, heard only the wind moving through the bare branches of the cottonwood by her cabin, and the cry of a hawk somewhere high above the prairie. That silence was familiar. It was the silence of being alone with a task that no one else believed in. The silence of faith tested against nothing but your own conviction. She had lived in that silence for months now. She would live in it a while longer. October brought colder nights, not yet dangerous, not the killing cold that would come in December and January, the cold that could freeze exposed flesh in minutes, that could turn a living body into a still one in less time than it took to pray. But cold enough to test. The first real wind came on the 15th of October. Not a storm, just wind. Sustained and steady, pushing across the open land from the northwest, with nothing to stop it for 100 miles, building speed and strength. With every mile it traveled until it reached the small collection of structures that Cora Sutter called home. She was inside the cabin when it started, heard it building like a train approaching from the distance. Felt the walls shift slightly as the pressure hit them. The children looked up from their books, eyes wide in the lamplight. "Stay here," Cora said. "Keep the fire." She stepped outside into the wind. It hit her immediately, hard enough to make her lean into it, cold enough to bite at the exposed skin of her face and hands. This was not the worst it would get. Not even close. But it was real, and real was what she needed. She entered the tunnel. The change was immediate. Inside, the wind still moved. She could feel it. But it moved differently. The force that had pushed against her outside now seemed to come from multiple directions at once. Smaller currents that interfered with each other, canceling out part of their strength. She walked slowly, one hand on the woven wall, feeling it flex under the pressure. The structure moved. It was not rigid, had never been meant to be rigid. It bent inward in places, swayed in others, absorbed the force rather than resisting it. The wind did not pass cleanly through. It broke. It split. It slowed. By the time it reached her, moving through the tunnel's center, it had lost something. Not everything, but enough. She stopped at the midpoint, closed her eyes, felt. There, a section where the wind entered stronger than elsewhere. A weakness in the weave, or perhaps a gap in the mud coating, or perhaps just an unfortunate alignment of the structure with the prevailing direction. She marked it in her mind. She would return tomorrow with more willow, more mud, more attention. She continued to the silo, opened the door, stood inside for a moment, listening to the wind howl against the walls, feeling the structure shake but hold. Then she filled a small sack with corn cobs, returned through the tunnel, stepped back into the cabin where her children waited. The whole trip had taken maybe 5 minutes. 5 minutes in which she had been exposed to the wind for perhaps 30 seconds total. The rest of the time she had been protected, not warm, not comfortable, but protected enough. That was the difference. The tunnel did not eliminate the cold. It did not eliminate the wind. It eliminated the crossing. And the crossing was where people died. The work continued. It always continued. That was something Cora had learned in her years on this land. Something that separated the survivors from those who did not survive. The work never ended. The moment you decided something was finished, that was the moment it began to fail. She reinforced the sections where the wind had entered strongest. She added more weave, more material, more control. She walked the tunnel every day, morning and evening, feeling for new weaknesses, listening for new sounds that indicated new problems. November came. Frost stayed through the mornings now. The ground hardened, the river slowed the air, sharpened into something that tasted of iron and ice. The world contracted color, leaching out of the landscape until everything was brown and gray and white. The palette of waiting, the tunnel remained. Unbroken, functional. The laughter had faded by then. Not replaced by respect exactly, replaced by something quieter, by silence. People had stopped paying attention. That was fine. That was perhaps even better than the alternative. What people stopped watching often mattered most. The tunnel did not need witnesses. It did not need believers. It only needed to work. And so far, it worked. Holbrook came on a gray afternoon in late November. He rode slowly up the path as he always did, never in a hurry, never urgent. A man in his early 50s who had lived on this land longer than most, who had buried a wife and 2 children, to the winters and the fevers and the endless, small catastrophes that this country inflicted on those who tried to make it home. He was not a friend exactly. Friendship required a kind of social interaction that neither of them had energy for. But he was not an enemy either. He was something rarer out here. He was a witness. A person who watched without judging, who observed without concluding. He dismounted at the edge of her property, tied his horse to the fence post, walked the rest of the way on foot. His boots crunched on the frozen ground, each step deliberate, measured. He stopped when he reached the tunnel entrance. For a long moment, he simply looked at it. His eyes moved along the length of the structure, taking in the details. The curve of the willow ribs, the density of the weave, the patches of mud that covered the outer surface like a second skin. Then he reached out and touched it. His hand pressed against the woven wall gently at first. Then, with more force, he watched how the structure responded. The slight give, the flexibility, the way it absorbed pressure rather than fighting it. "That will not stop cold," he said finally. "It is not meant to," Cora replied. She had come out of the cabin when she heard his horse approach, had been standing in the doorway watching him examine her work. Now she stepped closer, joining him at the tunnel entrance. He looked at her, waiting. She did not continue. She had learned that Holbrook was not a man who accepted answers easily. He had seen too much, buried too many, to trust something that did not look like strength. He needed to arrive at understanding on his own terms in his own time. Explanation would not speed that process. It might even slow it. "This will fail," he said. "Then it will fail," she answered. He stood there a moment longer, studying her face with the same careful attention he had given the structure, looking for something. Uncertainty, perhaps. Fear. The cracks that would indicate she did not believe her own work. He did not find them. Finally, he nodded. Once. Not agreement. Not approval. Something else. Acknowledgement. Then he turned, walked back to his horse, mounted, and rode away without another word. Cora watched him go until he disappeared over the slight rise to the east, until even the sound of his horse's hooves faded into the endless silence of the prairie. Then she went back to work. The days shortened. Darkness came earlier each evening, lasted longer each morning. The sun, when it appeared, hung low on the southern horizon, casting long shadows that stretched across the land like reaching fingers. The children stayed inside more now. Ruth worked on her letters, copying passages from the single book. They owned a Bible that had belonged to Thomas and his father before him. James drew pictures on scraps of paper, simple images of horses and houses and stick figures that might have been his family, or might have been anyone. Cora watched them sometimes in the evenings when the work was done for the day, and the lamp was lit, and the stove radiated heat into the small space of the cabin. She watched them and felt something that was not quite peace, but was perhaps its distant cousin, a kind of acceptance, an understanding that whatever happened in the months ahead, she had done what she could do. The rest was beyond her control. Winter would come. The storms would come. The cold that killed, and the wind that buried, and the darkness that seemed sometimes to have no end. She could not stop these things. No one could. But she could change how she met them. That was the only power anyone had in the end. Not power over circumstance, not power over the world, just power over response, just the ability to prepare to adapt, to learn from what had come before, and apply those lessons to what was coming next. The tunnel stretched between her cabin and her silo, 63 feet of woven willow and mud, and months of labor. It was not a guarantee. It was not a promise. It was just a possibility. A way through. That was all she had ever wanted. December came without warning. It always did. One day the sky was gray, but open clouds scattered across the horizon like sheep on a distant hillside. The next day it was different. The quality of light changed. The air changed. Something in the atmosphere shifted. Some balance tipped, and suddenly you could feel it coming even before you could see it. Cora felt it. She had felt it before every winter since she had arrived in this place. That particular pressure, that particular stillness, that sense of the world holding its breath before the first blow landed. She stood at her cabin door on the morning of December 4th and looked at the sky. Pure white, uniform. A ceiling of cloud that stretched from horizon to horizon, without break or variation pressing down on the land like a weight. The temperature had dropped overnight. Her breath steamed in the air, thick white clouds that dissipated slowly in the still morning. Still. That was what struck her, the absolute stillness of the air. No wind, no movement, nothing. That was the warning. She turned back into the cabin. Ruth, James, help me bring in wood. They did not argue, did not question. They had learned, as she had learned, as everyone who survived here eventually learned. When the work needed doing, you did it. Questions came later, if later came at all. They worked through the morning carrying wood from the pile beside the cabin to the interior stack near the stove. Then water bucket after bucket hauled from the well and poured into the cistern inside. Then food, the last of the root vegetables brought up from the cellar and arranged where they could be reached without going outside. By afternoon, the preparations were complete. And still the sky hung white and still and waiting. "Mother," Ruth asked. Cora looked at her daughter, 8 years old and already too wise for her age, already carrying knowledge that should have taken decades to accumulate. Eyes that had seen death and loss and recovery and the endless cycle of seasons that this land imposed on everyone who stayed. Yes. Will the tunnel work? Cora considered the question, considered the honesty it deserved. "I do not know," she said finally, "but it will do something, and something is more than nothing." Ruth nodded, accepting this answer in the way children accept things they do not fully understand, but trust anyway. The afternoon passed. The evening came. The storm did not. It came on the second night. Cora woke to the sound of wind, not the gradual building she had heard in October, but a sudden onset, as if the atmosphere had been holding back, and then released all at once. The cabin walls shook. The windows rattled in their frames. The fire in the stove flickered despite the closed damper, as pressure changes pulled at the air inside. She rose, checked the children, still sleeping somehow, their young bodies demanding rest, even when the world outside was trying to tear itself apart. She moved to the window, looked out. Nothing. Pure white nothing. The darkness of night combined with the whiteness of wind-driven snow to create something that was neither dark nor light, but simply absent. No visibility, no distance, no landmarks, just white. She could not see the silo, 63 feet away, invisible. The storm continued through the night and into the morning. By dawn, the light had changed, but the visibility had not. White daylight instead of white darkness, but the same absence of shape or form or meaning. Cora stood at her door and looked at the entrance to the tunnel. It was still there, still visible. Snow had begun to build against it, piling at the outer edges of the weave, but not inside. The structure was creating a small pocket of relative calm, a space where snow accumulated differently than it did against solid walls. That mattered. She did not test it. Not yet. The storm was still too strong, still too violent. There was no need to reach the silo yet. They had supplies, had fuel, had everything required to wait. And so she waited. The first storm lasted 2 days. When it passed, she walked the tunnel for the first time under real conditions. The weave had held. Snow pressed against the outer surface in places, but the interior remained clear. The air inside was still cold, still moving, but the violence was gone. She made it to the silo in 3 minutes. 3 minutes of exposure. 3 minutes of cold. But 3 minutes in which the wind did not drive into her, in which the snow did not blind her, in which she could move at a normal pace, rather than fighting for every step. She returned with fuel, fed the stove, watched the heat rise. It held longer than before, because she had not lost everything on the crossing, because the system was working. The second storm came 4 days later, worse than the first. The third storm came 2 days after that. This one was different. This one changed everything. Visibility disappeared. Distance collapsed. The world reduced to immediate space, and beyond that, nothing. The silo vanished from sight, as it had the year before, as it would always do when the worst came. But this time, Cora Sutter was not standing at her door with only a rope between her and survival. This time she had something else. She had built a way through, and she was about to find out if it would hold. The third storm did not announce itself with stillness. It came screaming out of the northwest on the 8th of December. A wall of white fury that swallowed the horizon and kept coming. Kept building, kept pressing against everything in its path with a force that seemed almost personal. As if the winter itself had grown tired of patience and decided to end things quickly. Cora was at the window when the first edge of it hit. She had been watching the sky all morning, reading signs that most people never learn to see. The particular texture of the clouds. The way birds had disappeared from the air 2 days before. The strange warmth that had come the previous afternoon, a fall spring that lasted only hours before the temperature plunged again. These were warnings. The land spoke to those who knew how to listen, and Cora had learned to listen. The children were behind her. Ruth working on her letters at the small table, James playing with wooden blocks that Thomas had carved in some distant summer, when the future still seemed like something that would include him. They looked up when the sound changed, when the wind hit the cabin walls with enough force to make the timbers groan. "It's here," Cora said. She did not need to explain what she meant. The first hours were manageable. Wind howled around the cabin, finding every crack and gap in the construction, pushing fingers of cold air into spaces that had seemed sealed. The fire in the stove burned steady, consuming wood at a rate that Cora tracked automatically, calculating how long their supply would last. At this pace, adjusting the damper to find the balance between warmth and conservation. Snow accumulated against the eastern wall, against the door, against every vertical surface that interrupted the wind's path. Through the window, she could see it building, watch the drifts grow from inches to feet in what seemed like moments, but the tunnel held. She checked it every few hours, opening the interior door that connected the cabin to the structure's entrance, looking down its length toward the silo she could not see. Snow pressed against the outer weave, white against the brown of willow and mud. But the interior remained clear. The wind entered, yes. Cold entered, but neither entered with the force they carried outside. The tunnel was doing what she had designed it to do. It was interrupting. By the second day, the storm had not weakened. If anything, it had intensified. The wind no longer came in gusts, but in a continuous assault. A pressure so constant that it began to feel less like weather and more like a physical weight pressing down on everything. The cabin creaked and settled. Ice formed on the inside of the windows despite the fire fractal patterns spreading across the glass like frozen lightning. The children stayed close to the stove. Ruth read aloud from the Bible, her voice steady, despite the chaos outside, working through passages she had read 100 times before. The familiar words seemed to help, seemed to create a small space of order within the larger disorder of the storm. James listened or did not listen, his attention drifting between his sister's voice and the sounds that penetrated the walls. The deep groaning of stressed timber, the sharp crack of something outside breaking, probably a branch, possibly something worse. The endless, relentless howl of wind that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Cora moved between the stove and the tunnel entrance, checking one then the other, maintaining both systems. Fuel went into the fire. Attention went into the structure. She noticed things. The weave bowed inward in certain sections, pressed by the accumulated weight of snow on the exterior. The mud coating had cracked in places, gaps appearing where before there had been solid surface. The willow ribs flexed more than they had during the October test, their green strength yielding to the sustained assault. But nothing broke. Flexibility was strength. Yielding was survival. The tunnel moved with the storm rather than against it, absorbing force through motion rather than trying to resist with rigidity. This was the principle she had built upon. This was the theory becoming practice. And so far, the practice held. On the third morning, she needed fuel. The stack beside the stove had diminished faster than expected. The sustained cold demanded more heat, and more heat demanded more fuel. and the careful calculations she had made before the storm now needed revision. She would have to cross. "Stay here," she told Ruth. "Keep James warm. Keep the fire going. I will return." Ruth nodded, her young face serious with understanding. She did not argue, did not question, did not ask the obvious question that hung in the air between them. What if you don't? Some questions were better left unspoken. Cora moved to the interior door, the one she had cut specifically for this purpose, the passage that led directly into the tunnel, rather than into open air. She opened it. The sound changed immediately. Wind rushed past the tunnel entrance, a river of frigid air moving at speed she could hear but not see. Snow swirled at the edges, white chaos marking the boundary between protected space and killing exposure. But inside the tunnel, the chaos was muted. She stepped in, pulled the door closed behind her. The world transformed. Outside, the storm raged with a fury that would kill an exposed person in minutes. Here, inside the woven structure, that fury was less. Not absent, not comfortable, but reduced enough that she could stand without bracing against the wind, could breathe without fighting for every inhalation, could see not far, but far enough. She moved forward, one step at a time, one hand on the woven wall, not because she needed guidance, but because she was measuring, feeling, assessing the structure's condition with every foot of progress. The air moved around her, currents finding their way through the weave from multiple directions. But the currents were small, manageable, nothing like the scouring force outside. The cold existed, yes, the cold was real, but it did not bite into her the way it would have in the open. It touched rather than tore. She reached the midpoint, stopped, listened. Not for sound exactly, for absence. For the silence that would indicate structural failure, the cracking or tearing or sudden shift that would mean the system was failing. She heard none of these things. The tunnel groaned softly, willow flexing under sustained load. But it was a sound of adaptation, not collapse. The sound of something bending rather than breaking. The sound of design working as intended. She continued. 30 feet. 40. 50. The silo door emerged from the white ahead, a dark rectangle that seemed almost impossible in a world that had become nothing but white. She reached it, grasped the handle, pulled. The door resisted. Ice had formed around its edges, sealing it in place. She pulled harder, felt the seal break, felt the door swing open. Inside the silo, the air was different. Not warm. Nothing was warm in this cold. But stable. The wind did not reach. Here could not penetrate the solid walls of the structure. The corn cobs sat stacked where she had left them. Fuel enough for weeks if she was careful. She filled her sack quickly, efficiently, taking only what she needed for the next day. More would be harder to carry through the tunnel's confined space, and more carried more risk. She had learned this already. Learned that survival was about small trips repeated safely, rather than desperate journeys carrying too much. She closed the silo door, returned through the tunnel step by measured step, emerged into the cabin, closed the interior door, set down the sack. Ruth looked up from the stove. "You made it." "Yes." It was not a complicated exchange. It did not need to be. The fact itself was enough. She had crossed. She had returned. The system worked. The third storm lasted 5 days. By the fourth day, the world had ceased to exist outside the small bubble of the cabin and the tunnel and the silo. Everything else was white, was wind, was cold, so complete it seemed less like temperature and more like the absence of everything that made life possible. Cora crossed twice more during those 5 days. Each crossing followed the same pattern. Check the tunnel. Enter. Move slowly, one hand on the wall. Feel for weakness. Listen for failure. Reach the silo. Take only what was needed. Return. The children watched her go each time, with eyes that had learned not to show fear. Ruth kept the fire. James stayed close to his sister. They did not discuss the possibility that one of these crossings might be the last, but they all knew. This was the truth of this place, the truth of this life. Death was not a distant possibility to be contemplated in abstract terms. It was present. It was close. It waited at the edge of every decision, every action, every moment of insufficient preparation. You did not defeat it. You simply kept moving, kept working, kept maintaining the systems that held it at bay. For one more hour, one more day, one more winter. On the 5th day, something changed. Cora woke to silence. Not complete silence. Wind still moved outside, still pressed against the walls, still carried snow across the frozen landscape. But the violence had diminished. The sustained assault had become something less, something more like weather, and less like war. She rose, checked the children, checked the fire. Then she moved to the window and looked out. She could see the fence. It was not much, just the top rail of the fence that marked her property line visible through the thinning snow, as a dark line against the white. But it was distance. It was visibility. It was the first indication in 5 days that a world existed beyond the immediate space of the cabin. The storm was passing. She felt something then. Standing at that window, looking at that fence line. Not quite relief. Not quite triumph. Something more complicated than either of those simple emotions. She felt the beginning of understanding. The storm did not end that day. It took another full day to weaken enough that travel became possible, and even then possible was a generous term. The drifts had accumulated to heights that transformed the landscape, burying familiar features beneath white mounds that bore no resemblance to the ground they covered. But the immediate violence was over. And then on the 6th day, something worse began. The wind dropped. Not completely. Wind on the open prairie never stopped completely, but it reduced, slowing from a sustained assault to something gentler, something almost peaceful. This was not peace. Cora understood this immediately. Understood it in her bones, the way she understood breathing and hunger, and the need to keep her children alive. The drop in wind was not the end of danger. It was the transformation of danger into something different and potentially worse. Because now the snow fell straight down. Heavy. Relentless. Without the wind to scatter it, without the horizontal movement that had characterized the storm's first phase. The snow accumulated with terrible efficiency. It piled on every surface, built against every vertical obstacle, pressed down with a weight that seemed to increase by the hour. She opened the cabin door on the morning of the 7th day, or tried to open it. The door moved an inch, then stopped. Snow, packed solid against the exterior, not drifted, but compacted a wall of white that had formed while she slept. She pushed harder. The door did not move. She closed it again. Did not force it. Forcing would break what must remain usable. That was the lesson of flexibility. The lesson of the tunnel. The lesson of everything she had learned about surviving in a place that did not want you to survive. She turned instead, walked to the interior door, opened it. The tunnel entrance was partially blocked, snow having accumulated there as well. But the blockage was different, looser, manageable. She cleared it with her hands, pushing the white mass aside, creating a passage wide enough to enter. Then she stepped through. The tunnel had changed, not failed, changed. Snow pressed against the outer weave with new weight, the accumulation of the silent snowfall adding to what the wind had already deposited. The structure bowed inward more than before, the willow ribs flexing under the sustained load, creating a passage that was narrower than its original design, but still passable, still functional. Cora moved forward slowly. She did not rush. Rushing in confined spaces caused collapse. Rushing in survival situations caused death. She moved at the pace the situation demanded, carefully, deliberately testing each foot of progress before committing to the next. At the midpoint, she stopped. The tunnel was narrowest here, the weave pressed inward from both sides until the original 6-foot width had reduced to perhaps 4 feet. Still enough to move through. Still enough to carry supplies. But the margin had shrunk. She continued. The silo door was harder to open this time, ice thicker around its edges. Snow piled higher against its base. But it opened. She entered. She filled her sack. On the return journey, she examined the tunnel more carefully. The outer layers had held. The weave had not torn. The willow ribs had not snapped. Everything she had built was still functioning, still doing the job she had designed it to do. But the system was under stress, and stress maintained too long became failure. She worked that afternoon despite the cold, despite the exhaustion, despite everything her body was telling her about rest and recovery. She cleared snow from the tunnel's outer surfaces where she could reach them. She examined the weave for gaps, for weaknesses, for places where the mud coating had failed. She made mental notes of sections that would need repair when conditions allowed. The children helped where they could. Ruth cleared the interior entrance, keeping it passable. James carried the smaller tools, too young for the real work, but needing to contribute anyway, needing to feel useful in a situation that made usefulness the only thing that mattered. By evening, the tunnel was stable again. Not perfect. Not as strong as it had been before the storms began. But stable enough to continue functioning, to continue providing the one thing it had been designed to provide: a way through. The snow continued falling through the 8th day and into the 9th. Cora crossed twice more, bringing fuel, bringing supplies, maintaining the rhythm of survival that she had established. Each crossing was harder than the last, as snow accumulated and the tunnel narrowed and the weight on the structure increased. But each crossing was possible. That was the difference. That was everything. On the morning of the 10th day, she stood at the interior door and looked down the length of the tunnel, assessing its condition with eyes that had learned to see structural truth rather than appearance. It would hold, for now. But for how much longer the visitors came on the 11th day, not visitors exactly, survivors. People who had heard the stories, who had watched from a distance, who had dismissed the widow's tunnel as foolishness, until the storm proved their own preparations inadequate. Cora saw them through the window, figures struggling through the drifts, making their way toward her property from the east. Two of them moving slowly, helping each other over the accumulated snow. She recognized them as they got closer. The Whitmore boys, Jed and Orrin, the same ones who had laughed at her structure months ago, who had spread the story of the widow's basket through the valley, who had been so certain of her failure. They were not laughing now. She opened the door, or tried to. The snow had accumulated again during the night. She forced it this time, breaking through the compacted white, creating an opening wide enough to step through. The cold hit her immediately sharp after the relative warmth of the cabin. She waited as they approached, watching their struggle through the drifts, watching the exhaustion in their movements. They reached the edge of her property, stopped. "We heard," Jed said, his voice rough with cold and exertion. "We heard you can get through." She did not respond immediately. Silence could be an answer, too. "Our supplies," Orrin added. "We cannot reach our supplies. The barn is buried. Everything is buried." She looked at them, these young men who had found her so amusing months ago. Their faces were red with cold, raw with wind exposure. Their eyes held something that had not been there before. Fear. Not the abstract fear of something that might happen. The concrete fear of something that was happening, that would continue happening, that would kill them if they could not find a solution. "The tunnel," she said, finally gesturing toward the structure. "You want to see it." They nodded. She turned, walked toward the entrance, did not wait to see if they followed. They would follow or they would not. Their choice was not her concern. They followed. Into the tunnel, through the narrowed passage, their shoulders brushing the inward bowed walls as they moved. She heard their breathing change as they entered, heard the sharp intake as they realized what the structure was doing, how it was working. The wind still moved outside, still drove snow across the landscape. But inside the tunnel, that wind became something else. Something survivable. They emerged at the silo end, stood blinking in the diminished light, looking back along the passage they had just traveled. "It works," Jed said. The words held wonder, and something else beneath the wonder. Shame, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding that the world did not always operate according to the assumptions you brought to it. "Yes," Cora said. "It works." She opened the silo door, showed them the interior. The corn cobs stacked in their rows. The fuel that had kept her and her children alive through 11 days of storms that would have killed them otherwise. "How?" Orrin asked. "It does not stop the cold," she said. "It does not stop the wind. It just slows them, changes how they move, gives you time." They did not understand. Not fully. She could see that in their faces, in the way they looked at the woven walls, as if expecting them to reveal their secrets through visual inspection alone. But they understood enough. They understood that this woman they had laughed at, this widow with her basket tunnel, had built something that worked when their own preparations had failed. They understood that survival was not about strength or force or resistance, but about something more subtle. Something they were only beginning to see. They left that afternoon heading back toward their own property with knowledge they had not possessed before. Cora watched them go from the tunnel entrance, watched them struggle through the drifts that seemed slightly less impossible now that the snow had paused. They moved differently than they had arrived. Not defeated exactly, but changed. She returned to the cabin, fed the fire, checked the children, resumed the work of maintaining the system that was keeping them all alive. The tunnel had held. Through 11 days of the worst winter this valley had seen in a decade, the tunnel had held. And people were beginning to notice. On the 14th day, Holbrook came. Not alone this time. He brought another man, younger, stronger, but moving with the uncertain gait of someone who was not sure his body would continue responding to his commands. They approached from the east, visible first as dark shapes against the white, then gradually resolving into human forms. Cora met them at the property line. Holbrook's face was gray with exhaustion, his movements slower than she had ever seen them. The younger man she did not recognize at first. Then she did. Tolliver, a farmhand who worked the spreads to the south, young enough to still believe that strength could overcome any obstacle. His face told a different story now. The cold, Holbrook said. We nearly did not make it. She nodded, gestured toward the cabin. Inside. Warm first. They followed her, stumbling through the last of the drifts through the cleared space around her door, into the warmth of the cabin, where the stove radiated heat like a small sun. The children moved aside, making room. Ruth brought water heated on the stove. James watched with wide eyes, seeing in these exhausted men something he would remember for the rest of his life. This was what the winter could do. This was what they were fighting against. Holbrook did not speak at first. He sat near the stove, hands extended toward the heat, absorbing warmth that his body desperately needed. His breath came in slow, measured draws, the breathing of someone who had been near the edge and was now stepping carefully back from it. Tolliver was worse. His hands shook with something beyond cold, a trembling that came from the body's systems beginning to fail. His face had the waxy look of frostbite beginning, though she could not yet tell how severe. Cora brought warm cloths, wrapped them around his hands, around his face. Not hot. Heat too fast would damage what cold had already begun to destroy. Warmth applied gradually, allowing the body to recover at its own pace. This was another lesson the land had taught her. Slow restoration. Gradual return. The same principle that made the tunnel work applied to human flesh as well. After perhaps an hour, Holbrook spoke. The silo, he said. She looked at him, waiting. You go through that. Not a question. A statement being confirmed. Yes. In this. Yes. He nodded slowly, processing information that did not fit the models he had built over 50 years of living. His eyes moved to the interior door, the one that led to the tunnel entrance. Show me, he said. She did not argue, did not explain. She simply rose, walked to the door, opened it. The tunnel stretched before them, slightly narrowed from the accumulated stress of 14 days, but intact, functional. Holbrook rose, moved toward it, stood at the entrance looking down its length. Then he entered. She followed, watching him as he moved, his hand on the woven wall, his feet careful on the packed snow floor, his body learning what words could not teach, the change in the air, the reduction of wind, the way cold existed but did not assault, the way death was present but not immediate. He reached the silo, opened the door, looked inside. Then he returned step by careful step through the passage that should not have worked but did. When he emerged back into the cabin, his face held something new. Not understanding exactly. Understanding would take time. But the beginning of understanding. The crack through which understanding would eventually enter. "It holds," he said. "Yes." Long silence. The fire crackled. The wind pressed against the walls outside. Tolliver's breathing gradually steadied as warmth returned to his core. Then Holbrook said the thing that changed everything. "We could not reach our supplies. The barn is buried. The path is impossible. We have perhaps 2 more days of fuel." He paused. "If this holds, if it continues to hold, we need to understand it." She nodded. "Not now," she said. "Now you rest. Now you recover. Understanding comes later." He accepted this. He had no choice. His body demanded rest more than his mind demanded answers. They stayed that night, Holbrook and Tolliver, sleeping near the stove, while the storm continued its slow dying outside. Ruth gave up her bed. James shared his blanket. The cabin designed for 3 held 5. But it held. That was what mattered. Systems that held. The next morning, the sky began to clear. Not completely. Clouds still covered half the horizon, and wind still moved snow across the landscape in low curtains. But the violence had passed. The sustained assault had ended. What remained was assessment, counting, understanding what had been lost and what had survived. Holbrook stood at the cabin door, looking out at the transformed landscape. Drifts had buried familiar features, changed the shape of the land, created new obstacles where none had existed before. But the tunnel was still there, still visible, still functional. "You built this," he said. "Yes." "Alone?" "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment. "They laughed at you?" "Yes." "They were wrong." She shook her head slightly. "They were uninformed." He turned to look at her, parsing the distinction. "Wrong implies they knew and chose poorly," she explained. "Uninformed means they did not know. The difference matters." He considered this. Because one can be corrected and the other cannot. No, both can be corrected. But the approach is different. Wrong people need to be convinced. Uninformed people need to be shown. She gestured toward the tunnel. "I did not argue with them. I showed them. Now they are beginning to see." Holbrook nodded slowly, understanding the principle, even if he did not yet understand all its applications. "What happens now?" Tolliver asked. He had recovered somewhat color returning to his face, strength returning to his voice. But the experience had changed him. She could see it in his eyes. He had been near death, and nearness to death changes how a person sees everything that follows. Now, Cora said, the real work begins. They left that afternoon, Holbrook and Tolliver heading back toward their own properties with knowledge they had not possessed 2 days before, but the knowledge was incomplete. They understood that the tunnel worked. They did not yet understand why. They understood that it could be built. They did not yet understand how. Those understandings would come, but not immediately. Not in the middle of winter. Not when survival still demanded everything they had. Spring would come. Snow would melt. Ground would soften, and then, perhaps they would be ready to learn. The storms were not over. 3 more came in December, each one testing the tunnel. Each one revealing new weaknesses that needed addressing. Cora worked between storms, reinforcing sections that had bowed too far, replacing weave that had torn, reapplying mud to gaps that had opened in the coating. The work never ended. That was the truth she had known from the beginning, the truth that the tunnel embodied. Systems that worked required constant attention. The moment you decided something was finished, that was the moment decay began. But she was not working alone anymore. After the 3rd December storm, the Whitmore boys returned. Not to laugh this time, to watch, to learn. They stood at the tunnel entrance observing as she wove new willow into a damaged section, seeing the technique even if they did not yet understand the principle behind it. After the 4th storm, Lenora Whitmore came, the sister, older than her brothers, more observant than they would ever be. She asked questions that the boys had not thought to ask. Not just how, but why. Not just what, but when. Cora answered when she could, remained silent when she could not. Some things could be taught. Others could only be experienced. January came, the coldest month, the killing month. But January was different this year. Not the weather. The weather was the same as every other January Cora had experienced since coming to this place. Cold beyond imagining. Wind that never stopped. Snow that fell and fell and fell until you began to wonder if there was any other kind of sky. What was different was the tunnel. It held. Through the sustained assault of January's worst, it held. It flexed and bowed and adapted, but it did not fail. It gave Cora passage to her silo every day she needed it. Gave her access to the fuel that kept her family alive. Gave her the one thing that the previous winters had nearly taken from her: control. Not control over the weather. That was impossible. Not control over the cold or the wind or any of the forces that made this land deadly. Control over her response to those forces. Control over how much they cost her each time she had to face them. The tunnel did not eliminate the crossing between cabin and silo. It just reduced what that crossing took, and reduction compounded across all the crossings of all the days of all the months of winter, became the difference between survival and failure. By February, others were watching. Not everyone. Some still dismissed the tunnel as the eccentric project of an eccentric widow. Some still believed that strength was the answer, that resistance was the path, that you fought the winter by opposing it directly. Those people would learn, or they would not. But enough were watching. Enough were beginning to understand. And when spring came, when the snow melted, and the ground softened, and the first green shoots began to emerge from earth that had seemed dead for months, those who had watched would remember. They would remember the tunnel that held. They would remember the woman who built it. They would remember that survival was not about fighting harder. It was about losing less. On the last day of February, Holbrook came again. He did not bring exhaustion this time. He brought something else. He walked the length of the tunnel slowly, his hand on the woven wall, feeling the texture of willow and mud that he had only glimpsed in his previous visit. He stopped at sections where repairs had been made, examined them, noted how new weave joined old. At the silo end, he stood looking back through the structure. "You are not building a tunnel," he said. Cora did not respond. She waited. "You were building a way to lose less." She nodded. That was exactly right. Not more heat. Not more strength. Not more resistance. Just less loss. That was the system. That was always the system. Holbrook turned to face her. "Teach us," he said. She looked at him, at this man who had watched her work for nearly a year, without fully understanding what she was doing. His face held something it had not held before. Not skepticism, not dismissal, readiness. "When the ground thaws," she said, "when you can work the willow, when you have time to prepare before the next winter comes." He nodded. "We will be ready." She believed him. The tunnel stood as winter ended, weathered, worn, bearing the marks of everything it had endured, but standing. That was what mattered. Not perfection, not beauty, not the approval of those who had laughed, or the vindication of being right when others were wrong. Just function. Just the ability to do what it had been designed to do. Cora stood at the tunnel entrance on a March morning when the first warm wind blew from the south, carrying the smell of distant earth and the promise of spring. The snow around her was melting, revealing ground she had not seen in months, revealing the shape of the land she had almost forgotten. The children ran past her. Ruth and James, their voices high with the joy of freedom after so long confined. They ran through the tunnel and back again, playing in the structure that had kept them alive. She watched them, and for the first time in a very long time, she allowed herself to feel something like hope. Winter would return. It always returned. But next time she would not face it alone. Spring came slowly to the valley as it always did. The snow did not melt so much as surrender, retreating inch by inch before the advancing warmth, revealing the land beneath in stages. First, the high ground, the rises and ridges where wind had scoured the accumulation thin. Then, the flat expanses, the open fields, where summer crops would eventually grow. Finally, the low places, the depressions and hollows where drifts had piled deepest, holding their ground until the very end. Cora watched the transformation from her cabin door each morning, tracking the recession of white across a landscape she had not seen clearly in 4 months. The tunnel emerged from its winter shroud, gradually its weathered surface appearing section by section as the snow pulled back. It looked different now than it had in autumn. The willow had darkened mud coating cracked and fallen away in places weave loosened, where sustained stress had stretched the fibers beyond their original tension. The structure sagged slightly at the midpoint, compressed by months of accumulated weight that had only recently been lifted. But it stood. That was what mattered. That was what the valley would remember. Not how the tunnel looked, but what it had done. What it had made possible during the deadliest winter anyone could recall. She began repairs in late March when the ground had thawed enough to yield new willow from the creek bed to the north. The children came with her on these trips. Ruth, old enough now to help with the cutting, James carrying bundles back to the sled, with the serious determination of a child who understood that play had seasons, and this was not one of them. They worked through April, replacing damaged sections, tightening loosened weave, reapplying mud to gaps that had opened during the long months of assault. The tunnel slowly recovered its shape, its integrity, its readiness for whatever the next winter would bring. And while they worked, people came to watch. They came in ones and twos at first. The curious and the skeptical, and those who fell somewhere between. They stood at the fence line as they had the previous autumn, looking at the structure that had become the valley's most unlikely survivor. But their posture was different now. Gone was the dismissive stance, the hands on hips, the head-shaking certainty of people who knew failure when they saw it. In its place was something quieter, something that looked almost like attention. Stegner came first, the farmer from 3 miles south, who had asked if she thought the tunnel would hold snow. He did not ask questions this time. He walked the property line, slowly studying the structure from multiple angles, his face holding the concentrated expression of someone trying to understand something that did not fit his previous understanding. He left without speaking. But he came back the next day, and the day after that. The Whitmore family came as a group in mid-April. Jed and Orrin, the brothers who had laughed loudest and longest. Lenora, their sister, who had asked the better questions during her winter visit. And others, parents and cousins and connections that Cora did not immediately recognize. They gathered at the tunnel entrance, a dozen people standing in a loose semicircle looking at the structure that had survived what their own preparations had not. Cora did not invite them closer, did not explain, did not defend. She continued working, weaving new willow into a section that had bowed too deeply during the February storms, her hands moving with the certainty of long practice. After a while, Jed stepped forward. "Show me," he said. The same words he had spoken during the winter when he had walked the tunnel for the first time. But the tone was different now. The arrogance was gone. In its place was something that might have been humility or might have been simply the recognition that he did not know as much as he had believed. Cora looked at him, measured him, not his strength, but his attention. Then she nodded. "Watch," she said. She continued working, but slower now, each movement deliberate, each technique visible. She did not explain in words what she was doing. Words would come later if they came at all. First came observation. First came seeing. The Whitmores watched. Some understood what they were seeing. Others did not. But all of them saw something that they would remember, something that would inform their thinking when they began building their own structures in the months ahead. Holbrook gathered a small group in late April. Not formally. Nothing here was ever formal. Just those who had come more than once, who had watched more carefully, who had asked fewer questions because fewer questions often meant better observation. They stood near the tunnel, not blocking it, not crowding it, giving it space. Even now it was part of a system, and systems failed when interfered with carelessly. Holbrook spoke first. "Tell them." Cora did not move immediately. Explanation had to be measured like everything else. Too much information too quickly was as useless as none at all. Understanding built slowly, layer by layer, the same way the tunnel itself had been built. Then she said, "It does not stop the cold." They waited. "It reduces how much the cold takes." Silence. Processing. She continued, "You cannot fight winter here." Heads nodded. They all knew that. They had always known that, even if they had not always admitted it. You can only reduce how much of it reaches you. She gestured toward the tunnel. "This reduces wind." She pointed toward the ground. "Reduces snow entering space." Then toward the cabin. "Reduces how much heat leaves when you move." Stegner spoke. The skeptic from the fence line, the one who had said wind does not slow. "So it is not protection," he said. "No." "What is it?" "Control." The word settled differently than he had expected. She could see it in his face, the slight shift in expression as he processed the distinction. Control did not mean dominance. Control did not mean elimination. Control meant influence, adjustment, the ability to change conditions slightly rather than the impossible goal of changing them completely. That was something they could understand. Lenora Whitmore stepped forward. "How did you know where to build it?" she asked. Cora shook her head. "I did not know." She pointed toward the land. "I watched." "Watched what?" "Wind, snow. Where it moved, where it slowed. Where it built, where it did not." Lenora nodded slowly, understanding forming behind her eyes. Not understanding of the specific, but understanding of the method. Observation before action. That was the difference between copying and comprehending. You could copy a tunnel. You could build something that looked exactly like what Cora had built in exactly the same place, with exactly the same materials. And it might fail completely, because the tunnel was not the answer. The observation was the answer. The understanding of how air moved across a specific piece of land, how snow accumulated in specific patterns, how the particular geography of a particular place created particular conditions that had to be addressed in particular ways. That could not be copied. That had to be learned. By the end of that week, 3 families had started building their own versions. Not identical. They could not be identical. Each property was different. Each distance between structures was different. Each wind pattern was different. That mattered. Systems had to match conditions, not assumptions. Stegner tried first. He built in a straight line, rigid frame boards instead of willow. Faster to construct, stronger in appearance. He finished in 3 days, stood back, and looked at it with the satisfaction of a man who had solved a problem efficiently. Cora walked past it one afternoon, did not stop, did not comment. She saw what he had built and knew what would happen. The first strong wind of May proved her right. The structure collapsed, inward boards splintering where they joined, frame buckling under pressure. It had been designed to resist, rather than absorb. Stegner stood looking at the wreckage, his face holding the confusion of someone whose assumptions had just been proven wrong. Cora came to look at it that evening. She did not criticize, did not explain what he should have done differently. She simply touched the broken frame, ran her hand along the splintered wood. "This resisted," she said. He nodded. "That is why it broke." She let the silence hold for a moment, let him process the principle himself, rather than having it explained to him. Resistance meets force with force. Force wins eventually. Always. He looked at her, then at the wreckage, then back at her. What should I have done? Yielded. She walked away. He would figure out the rest himself, or he would not. Some lessons could be taught. Others had to be discovered. Stegner rebuilt. Slower this time. More carefully. He used willow instead of boards, bent rather than straight woven, rather than nailed. The new structure was lower to the ground, more flexible, less impressive to the eye. But it moved with the wind rather than against it. And when the next strong wind came, it held. Summer passed in labor and learning. Cora's tunnel required constant maintenance, sections repaired and reinforced, weaknesses addressed before they became failures. She worked on it most mornings, the children helping where they could, the rhythm of maintenance becoming as natural as the rhythm of seasons. Others came to watch her work, to learn techniques, to ask questions that were more specific now. More informed questions that suggested genuine understanding rather than casual curiosity. Holbrook came most often. He did not build his own tunnel that summer. Instead, he watched. Always watched. Because he had learned that building without full understanding created false confidence, and false confidence killed. He changed smaller things instead. His door placement, his windbreak, his wood storage. All based on the same principle that animated the tunnel. Reduce loss. Do not try to increase supply. By late August, the valley had changed. Not visibly. Not in ways an outsider would notice. The land looked the same. The structures looked the same. The patterns of daily life looked the same. But something underneath had shifted. Paths had been reconsidered. Structures had been added between buildings not identical to Cora's tunnel, but built on the same principles. People moved differently now, thought differently, prepared differently. They measured more, wasted less, observed more, assumed less. The tunnel had not just survived the winter. It had survived into people's minds. Lenora Whitmore built the second successful tunnel in September. Not as long as Cora's, not as elaborate, just 40 feet connecting her family's cabin to their root cellar, the essential crossing that winter made most dangerous. She built it slowly, watching the wind for weeks before cutting the first willow. Understanding her property's specific patterns before committing to a specific design. When she finished, she walked through it once, then twice, then a third time. She stood at the midpoint and closed her eyes, feeling the air move around her. testing the structure with senses she had developed over months of observation. Then she walked to Cora's property. "It holds," she said. Cora nodded. "It will need maintenance." "I know." "It will fail in places." "I know." "You will have to fix it constantly." "I know." Cora looked at her, this woman who had learned what so many others had not. The work never ended. The system required attention every day, every week, every season. The moment you decided it was finished was the moment decay began. Lenora understood this. That understanding was worth more than any specific technique. The first cold nights came in October. Not dangerous yet. Not the killing cold, but enough to remind everyone what was coming. Enough to sharpen attention and accelerate preparation. Cora's tunnel had been repaired and reinforced throughout the summer. It stood now stronger than it had been the previous winter. Lessons learned from its first test applied to its second configuration. The weave was tighter in places that had shown weakness. The mud coating was thicker where wind had penetrated. The structure overall was more mature, more adapted to its purpose. But she knew it would still fail in places. That was the nature of systems. They failed. Always. The goal was not to prevent failure, but to anticipate it, to maintain actively, to address weakness before it became collapse. She walked the tunnel each morning as the days shortened and the nights lengthened. She felt for changes, listened for sound that indicated stress, prepared for what she knew was coming. Winter would return. It always returned. November brought the first real frost. Ice formed on the windows. The ground hardened. The sky took on that particular quality of light that meant snow was coming not immediately, but soon building somewhere beyond the horizon and moving closer with each passing day. The children felt it too. Ruth had grown over the summer, taller now, more capable, her hands showing the beginning of the calluses that would mark her as someone who worked. James had grown quieter, more observant, watching his mother work with an attention that suggested he was learning even when he was not asking questions. They prepared together as a family, now the three of them working through the checklist that Cora had developed over her years in this place. Wood stacked and accessible, food stored and organized, water arrangements secured against freezing, and the tunnel. Always the tunnel. They walked its length together one evening in late November, mother and daughter and son moving through the structure that had saved them the previous winter. "Will it hold again?" Ruth asked. Cora considered the question, considered the honesty it deserved. "I do not know," she said finally, "but it will do something, and something is more than nothing." Ruth nodded, accepting the answer as she had accepted it a year before. Some things could not be guaranteed. Some things could only be prepared for. The snow came on the 3rd of December. Not violently this time. Gently, almost softly, flakes drifting down from a gray sky in curtains that obscured the distance without eliminating it entirely. The land whitened slowly, familiar features disappearing beneath accumulation that built inch by inch through the day. Cora stood at her cabin door and watched. This was how it began. Always this way. Soft snow that seemed almost friendly, almost beautiful, giving no indication of what would follow. But she knew. And this year she was not the only one who knew. The first storm came a week later, not as severe as the storms of the previous winter. a test rather than an assault. Wind for 2 days, then calm. Snow for another day, then clearing. Cora crossed through the tunnel once each day, checking the silo, checking the structure itself, maintaining the system that had been maintaining her. The tunnel held. It flexed and bowed and adapted as it had been designed to do. Snow accumulated against the outer surface as it had the previous year. Wind penetrated in places as it always would, but the interior remained passable, functional. She was not the only one crossing. At Lenora's property, the shorter tunnel that connected cabin to cellar was being used daily. The structure handled the storm well, its design informed by observation of the specific conditions it would face. Stegner's rebuilt tunnel held too, though he had to clear accumulated snow from one section where his design had not adequately accounted for drift patterns. He learned from this, adjusted, prepared for the next storm. The valley was changing, one structure at a time, one lesson at a time, one winter at a time. The second storm came on the 20th of December. This one was worse. Wind from the northwest sustained and building, driving snow horizontally across the open ground with force that rattled windows and tested every structure in its path. Visibility disappeared. Distance collapsed. The world became immediate and small, reduced to what you could touch, and nothing more. Cora crossed through the tunnel twice that day, morning and evening. The structure performed as expected, reducing the wind, slowing the snow, giving her passage, when passage otherwise would have been impossible. But she was not just maintaining her own survival anymore. She was watching to see if the systems others had built would hold, watching to see if the lessons they had been learned deeply enough, watching to see if the valley had truly changed, or if it had only appeared to change. The answer came on the third day of the storm. Holbrook arrived at her property line, struggling through the drifts from the east, his face gray with cold, but his eyes sharp with purpose. He had come to report. "Stegner's holds," he said, when he reached the cabin, warming himself by the stove as he had the previous winter. "Some damage to the entrance, but passable." Cora nodded. "The Whitmores rebuilt their eastern windbreak. It is making a difference." She nodded again. "Lenora's tunnel is the best of them." She understood something the others did not. What Holbrook considered his answer. She understood that understanding takes time. She did not rush, did not assume she knew enough when she did not. Cora looked at him, seeing in his weathered face the recognition of a principle he had learned the hard way himself. "Most people want to build quickly," she said. "They want results before they have earned them." Yes. They copy without comprehending. Yes. And then they are surprised when the copy fails. Holbrook nodded slowly. "That is what I tried to tell Stegner." He listened eventually, after his first structure failed. Failure teaches. It does, but it does not have to be the only teacher. He looked toward the tunnel, visible through the window as a dark shape against the white chaos outside. "You could have taught them, explained everything from the beginning, given them the knowledge you had." Cora shook her head. "Knowledge given is not the same as knowledge earned." They had to see for themselves, had to feel it, had to understand not just what to do, but why? And if they had failed, if people had died because they did not understand quickly enough. She met his eyes. Then they would have died, as people die every winter, as people have always died in places that do not forgive mistakes. The words were hard, but they were true. She had not created the danger. She had only found a way to reduce it. If others failed to learn that way, the failure was not hers. The land killed those who did not understand it. That was the truth of this place. That was the truth of any place where survival was not guaranteed. The storm ended on the fourth day. Not gradually this time, but suddenly, the wind dying away as if a switch had been thrown. The snow stopping, the sky clearing to reveal a moon so bright it turned the white landscape silver. Cora stepped outside into the transformed world. The cold was intense. The deep cold that came when clouds no longer insulated the earth from the void above. Her breath hung in the air like small clouds, visible evidence of the warmth her body produced and the environment stole. But she did not feel vulnerable. She felt something else. Something she had not felt in all her years on this land. She felt that she was not alone. Across the valley, other structures stood. Other tunnels. Other windbreaks, other adaptations that people had built based on principles they had learned from watching her work. Not copies. Variations. Each one suited to its specific place, its specific conditions, its specific needs. The valley had changed. Not because she had changed it. Because she had shown what was possible. And others had seen, and seeing had led to understanding, and understanding had led to action. That was how change happened. Not through force, not through argument, not through trying to convince people who did not want to be convinced. Through demonstration, through survival, through being right in a way that could not be dismissed or ignored or explained away. January came, the coldest month, the month that had nearly killed her in winters past. But January was different now. Not the weather. The weather remained what it had always been, cold beyond imagining, wind that never stopped, snow that fell and fell until it seemed the sky was made of nothing else. What was different was the response. Cora crossed through her tunnel daily, maintaining the system, checking for weakness, making small repairs before small problems became large failures. Across the valley, others did the same. A network of maintained systems, each one imperfect, each one requiring constant attention, but each one functional. The killing cold still killed. There were losses that winter as there were every winter. A man from the far south of the valley, too stubborn to adapt, froze on the path between his house and his barn. A child from a family that had not prepared well enough. Taken by fever when they could not reach medicine in time. Death did not disappear, but it reduced. That was the principle. Not elimination of danger, reduction of loss. The same principle that animated the tunnel applied to an entire community. The last significant storm came in early February. 3 days of wind, 4 days of snow temperatures that dropped to levels Cora had rarely seen even in her worst winters. The sky turned a particular shade of white that seemed less like color and more like absence. She crossed through the tunnel each day, morning and evening. The structure held as it had held through every storm before. The weave bowed inward under accumulated snow. The willow flexed under sustained wind. The mud coating cracked and would need repair when conditions allowed. But the system remained functional. On the evening of the third day, Holbrook came again. Not struggling this time, not exhausted. He walked through the tunnel from the property line, moving with the confidence of someone who understood what the structure would and would not do. He emerged at the cabin end, stamped snow from his boots, entered when Cora opened the door. "It held," he said. Yes. All of them held. Every tunnel in the valley. Every windbreak. Every structure built on your principles. She nodded but did not speak. This was not about her. It had never been about her. "The losses this winter," Holbrook continued. "You know about them." Yes. 2 people in a winter that should have killed 20. She said nothing. The mathematics of survival were not something to celebrate. People had died. That was a tragedy, not a victory. "You changed something," he said. "You changed how we think." She shook her head. "No. You changed because you saw." He considered this. The distinction matters to you. It matters to truth. I did not convince anyone. I did not argue. I built something and it worked, and people saw that it worked. They changed themselves. Inspired by you. Informed by evidence. There is a difference. Holbrook nodded slowly, accepting the correction, understanding that his impulse to credit her was itself a form of misunderstanding. She had not led. She had demonstrated. She had not taught. She had worked where others could see. The valley had changed because evidence replaced opinion, because survival proved what argument could not. That was all. That was everything. Spring came earlier that year. Or perhaps it only seemed earlier because the winter had been survived more successfully than any winter before. The snow retreated in late February, revealing ground that felt like resurrection after months of burial. Cora stood at the tunnel entrance on a March morning when the first warm wind blew from the south. The structure had weathered another season. It stood now as something permanent, part of the landscape rather than an addition to it. The willow had rooted in places, sending small shoots upward from nodes that had been pressed into the ground. Life emerging from what had been designed only for function. She touched the woven wool, feeling the texture that had become as familiar as her own skin. "You did not build a tunnel," Holbrook said. She had not heard him approach. He stood behind her, looking at the structure, seeing something in it that he had not seen a year before. "No," she agreed. "What did you build?" She answered without pause. "A way to lose less." He smiled slightly, an expression she had rarely seen on his weathered face. "That is the clearest explanation I have heard. It is the only explanation that matters." She turned to face him. Not more heat, not more strength, not more resistance, just less loss. That is the system. That is always the system. The children ran past them, Ruth and James chasing each other through the tunnel, with the joy of young bodies that had been confined too long. Their laughter echoed through the woven passage, bright sounds, in a place that had known only wind and cold and survival for so many months. Cora watched them, not with the fierce protective attention of the winter months, but with something softer, something that acknowledged the danger they had passed through and the growth that passage had produced. Ruth was 9 now, a year older in calendar terms, but far more than that in understanding. She had learned things this winter that most people never learned, lessons about preparation and maintenance and the difference between systems that held and systems that failed. James was 7, still young enough for play, but old enough to remember. He would carry these winters with him, always would build on them when he was older, would perhaps teach his own children what the tunnel had taught him. Legacy. That was what this was about in the end. Not survival alone, though. Survival mattered. Not one winter, though one winter was what you faced when you faced it, but the accumulation of wisdom across generations, each one learning from the one before, each one building on what had been built. The tunnel would not last forever. Willow rotted. Mud crumbled. All structures eventually failed. But the principles would remain. The understanding would remain. The knowledge of how to observe and adapt and build systems that yielded rather than resisted. That was the true inheritance. That was what Cora Sutter had built, whether she had meant to build it or not. The valley settled into spring rhythms, planting, building, preparing for the summer that would prepare for the winter that would come again. The cycle continuing as it always continued, relentless and indifferent to human hope or human fear. But the preparation was different now. People thought differently, built differently, observed more carefully before committing to action. They understood, most of them, that the land could not be conquered, could not be forced, could only be negotiated with, accommodated, adapted to. This was not the only valley that faced hard winters. This was not the only place where survival demanded more than strength alone. But perhaps it was the only place where a widow's woven tunnel had shown an entire community what was possible. What might happen from here was not something Cora could predict. The future was always uncertain, always subject to changes that no one anticipated. Other valleys might learn what this one had learned, or they might not. Other generations might build on this foundation, or they might forget it entirely. That was beyond her control. What was within her control was maintenance, preparation, the daily work of keeping a system functional so that when the next test came, it would be ready. She returned to that work now as the spring warmth softened the ground and new growth began to emerge from earth that had seemed dead all winter. She repaired sections of the tunnel that had suffered during the storms. She replaced willow that had cracked, tightened weave that had loosened, reapplied mud to gaps that had opened. The work was slow and careful and never finished. It would never be finished. That was the point. On the last day of March, Cora walked the length of the tunnel, one final time before summer made such walks unnecessary. She moved slowly, one hand on the woven wall, feeling the texture that had become as familiar to her as anything she had ever known. The air inside was still and cool, different from the warm breeze outside, a remnant of winter, held in the structure's protected space. At the midpoint, she stopped. She closed her eyes. She listened, not for sounds exactly, for something else, for the quality of silence that indicated structural integrity, for the absence of stress that meant the system was at rest, ready for whatever would come next. She heard what she hoped to hear. Peace. Not the peace of ending. The peace of completion for now. The peace of a system that had done what it was designed to do and would do it again when called upon. She opened her eyes, continued to the silo end, emerged into the light of a spring afternoon. The valley spread before her, still marked by winter in places where snow lingered in shadows, but mostly green now, mostly alive, mostly recovered from the months of cold that had tested everything and everyone. She had survived another winter. Her children had survived. Her neighbors had survived, most of them more than had survived in any winter before. And a principle had taken root in the valley deeper than any willow she had planted, more durable than any structure she had built. Not fighting what could not be fought. Not resisting what could not be resisted. Just reducing loss. Just finding ways through. The children found her standing there looking out at the land that had nearly killed her so many times and had now become something closer to a partner than an enemy. Ruth stood beside her mother, following her gaze across the valley. "What are you looking at?" she asked. Cora considered the question. "Change," she said finally. Ruth frowned slightly. "Everything looks the same." "No, it looks the same, but it is not the same. The valley is different now. The people are different. The way they think about winter is different. Because of the tunnel. Because of what the tunnel showed them." Ruth considered this. "Will they remember?" she asked. "Some will. Some will not. But enough will remember. Enough will teach their children who will teach their children. And the knowledge will continue. Even after your tunnel is gone." Cora looked at her daughter, at this child who had grown so much in one hard year, who asked questions that most adults never thought to ask. "The tunnel was never the point," she said. "It was just the demonstration, the proof that something was possible. The principle is what matters. The principle is what will remain." Ruth nodded slowly, understanding forming behind her eyes. "Reduce loss," she said. "Yes." "Do not fight what cannot be fought." "Yes." "Find ways through." "Yes." Ruth looked at the tunnel, then back at her mother. "I want to build one," she said, "when I am older, on my own land." Cora smiled, a rare expression that transformed her weathered face into something younger, something hopeful. "You will," she said, "and it will be different from mine. It will have to be, because your land will be different. Your conditions will be different. Your specific problems will require specific solutions. But the principle will be the same. Yes, the principle will be the same." They stood together as the afternoon light stretched across the valley, mother and daughter, watching the land that had shaped them both. Behind them, the tunnel cast a long shadow across the ground, the woven structure dark against the brightening green of spring. It was just a tunnel. Just willow and mud and months of labor. Just a way to cross 63 feet without dying. But it was also something more. It was proof that survival did not require strength alone. It was demonstration that flexibility outlasted rigidity. It was evidence that observation preceded effective action. It was the beginning of change that would spread beyond this valley, beyond this generation, beyond anything Cora Sutter had imagined. when she bent the first willow branch into place. The valley would remember. Not her name, perhaps. Names faded. Stories changed. The specific details of who had built what and when would blur and shift across generations until the truth became legend. And legend became something else entirely. But the principle would remain. The understanding would endure. Winter would continue to come year after year, generation after generation. It would continue to test everyone who tried to make a home in places that did not welcome human life. But now there was a way through. Not a guarantee. Never a guarantee. Just a way to lose less. That was enough. That had always been enough. The tunnel stood behind them, waiting for the next winter. It would be ready.